Amen, Lord. Thank you. If I was to read to you what would be, I guess, the text for this morning, we'd be here a long time. But I always think of, the time the people were read to from sunset, for hours, and were standing. You read in the book of Nehemiah. But I would have to read from Genesis 37 to 50. Who is the main person that we read about in Genesis 37 to 50? Anyone?
You said Joseph.
It's Joseph. It's the story and it's the events surrounding the life of Joseph. And I'm not going to read all of those chapters today, but I will be looking at some verses from Genesis 37 and up through 50. So if you want to turn there, it might help you, but I will make sure to take time to tell you what passages I'm looking at that time. Now, Joseph is probably my favorite character in the Old Testament. All the stories we're taught in Sunday school and VBS, all the times we hear sermons, there's something about Joseph. And it's probably because when I was a teenager, I got a book, and I think it might be upstairs in my collection of books there, or it could be in my study at home. And I love the title of the book. The title is God Planned It for Good. And that has always encouraged me, because when we first read in chapter 37 of Genesis about Joseph, he's a 17-year-old teenager. That's why I mentioned our teenagers this morning. He was 17 years of age, and some bad things happened to him. And now, he might have been a catalyst for some of those things happening. And if I was to go in a different direction in my sermon today, I would tell you this. Sometimes when God shares something with you, it doesn't mean that you need to share that with other people. I could give you a couple examples of that. And in this case, it was a dream that Joseph had. He already started with a couple strikes against him. His dad had more than one wife and had concubines. And Rachel, the mother of Joseph, was his dad's favorite wife. And so Joseph ended up being one of just two children of Rachel. And because of Jacob loving, him more, the other children were a little bit jealous. And that could be another whole series about being careful about jealousy and favoritism. Because what do you know about Joseph? What did his dad give him that most of us know? What was the gift he gave him? A coat of many colors. When I was in college, I believe that's when the Amazing Technicolor coat, that whole musical came out, and I just was always fascinated with Joseph, the favorite son, given this coat that just rubbed sort of the faces of the brothers with, saying, look, I really am the favorite. And then he shows up one day and says, oh, let me tell you all, I had a dream. You're all going to bow down to me one day. That's not a way to engender harmony among siblings, is it? So what happened was the brothers were off tending flocks and doing their job, and the father says to 17-year-old Joseph, I need you to go check on your brothers. And I don't know what led to it. Maybe they had been talking amongst themselves all these months saying, what are we going to do about this guy? We don't like that he's the favorite, and it's really getting on our nerves. But in this case, we're told that when they saw Joseph coming to check on them, for whatever reason, one of them must have said, and a lot of others went along with it, this is our chance to get rid of him. And we're going to do something about it. And if you don't remember the story, what they did was they grabbed him and they threw him into a cistern. Fortunately, it was dry. There was no water in it. Cistern is, like an open well to capture water. And there he was. And I think they were talking about killing him because, if you remember, Reuben spoke up and said, no, let's not do that. And his plan was, if he could just get them to not kill Joseph, then later on, when he came back, he was going to free Joseph. But in the meantime, they saw coming a caravan of Ishmaelites. And these traders they decided to sell Joseph to. And we read that he was carried off to Egypt. And there he was sold and was bought by Potiphar, an official in the Pharaoh's government, so to speak. And he was there. So I don't know if you've had problems, but I don't think any of you have ever been sold into slavery and been dragged off to a foreign country. I don't think so. And hopefully none of you faced 11 angry brothers who wanted to kill you. And these are the things that happened to Joseph while he was just a 17-year-old boy. And if I can now put on my glasses, it will help me. I hope you can hear me, but I'm keeping the mask on as I told you why this morning. In chapter 37, as he's carried off, we get to where he becomes part of the household of Potiphar. And that we find in chapter 39 of Genesis. He'd been taken to Egypt, and there he was put into the employ or as a slave of Potiphar. Now, I want you to listen to verse 2 of chapter 39, because this, I think, is important. Before I get to the specific lessons I want you to take from today. The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered. We already talked about somebody else who the Lord was with, as we talked about Hezekiah, remember? And he prospered, because God was with him. So even in his foreign situation, in the household of Potiphar, far from his family and people, he was not abandoned, was he? God was with him. He was not left alone. And he prospered. And the master saw that the Lord was with him, and when he saw that, and that the Lord was giving him success in everything he did, he found favor in the eyes of Potiphar, and he soon rose to be head of the household. And quite an honor, considering he's a foreigner and so young. But then the story goes on to tell us that Potiphar's wife, for whatever reason, we're told, I guess in Scripture, says he was a well-built young man, and he obviously was quite proficient and talented and smart and personable. She tried to entice him into an act of adultery. And what was his answer to that? Well, I'm far away, I'm out of my country, I'm away from family, so what would it hurt? No, he didn't say that. He said, how can I sin against God? Even if no one here will know, no one here knows the 10 Commandments the way I do, because these are not Hebrews, these are Egyptians, I will stay faithful. And you know what happened at that point? When she tried to throw herself on him, we're told that he ran, and she had his coat, and he ran out. And she, I guess, was humiliated and so angry, she said, look what this slave you brought in to our home tried to do to me. And Potiphar was angry, and what happened to Joseph then? How many remember the story? He's thrown into prison. So first it seems like, well, life's not so bad, being sold here to Egypt. And now, even though he obeys God and stays faithful, he ended up in prison. And that's going to be one of our lessons I'm going to get to when I conclude today. And they're in prison because he was faithful to God. What do we read about that? In verse 21, the end of 20, in verse 21 of 39, it says, but while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. Wow, God can be with us even in the worst of situations. Here in prison, God is with him. And what happens? He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in that prison. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Folks, the Lord can be with us no matter what is happening in our lives, no matter how dire the situation. God is with us. And God can be with us and see things happen in our lives because he is faithful. Sometimes it seems that life is unfair, but I want you to know this: God is never unfair. He is faithful to his promise. And then, as the story goes, while he's in prison, he interprets a dream for two men, the baker and the cup holder, telling them that what's going to happen, that one of them will be restored to their position and the other one will be beheaded. And the cupbearer, who he says will be restored to his position, he says, when you come into, Pharaoh's service again, remember me. And he does, but how long did it take him to remember Joseph? Anyone remember? 2 years. 2 years Joseph remained in that prison until something happened to jog the memory of the cupbearer. And then he said, oh, there was this guy in prison. He tells Pharaoh, when Pharaoh has the dream of the cows, you all remember that? His dream was 7 fat cows, and then out of the river comes 7 scrawny cows who end up eating the fat cows. Then the 7 plump, grain heads, and then up comes the ugly ones that devour them. And he said, help me understand this dream, and no one could. And at that point, the cupbearer said, oh yeah, that's right. 2 years ago in prison, there was a guy who was able to interpret our dreams. And so Joseph was called, and again, he basically didn't take credit. He says, God will give me the answer. And he explained. How many of you remember what was going to happen? 7 years of plenty, of harvests that will be great, and then followed by what? 7 years of famine. And so Joseph explained, and I like how he explains it. He says, you should find somebody who can look over this and can gather the grain and prepare for those 7 years. And Pharaoh was smart. And I'm sure he was led by God, even though at this point he was not a God believer in the sense that we understand. But hello light. Well, I guess the light went off, but that's okay. I don't know what happened. Maybe it unplugged. Sometimes it comes loose. It decided to stop. There it is. And he was smart enough to realize, hey, wait, Joseph's smart. Joseph interpreted, and his suggestion makes sense. So he appointed Joseph. And as the story goes on, Joseph literally becomes the second command of all of Egypt. A foreigner, a Hebrew, formerly slave and prisoner, is now made second in charge of all of Egypt. And when the famine struck in the land of Canaan, where his family was, his brothers, his father, they were sent, the brothers, down to Egypt to buy grain. And you know the story there. They bought the grain, brought it home. He put the silver back in their bags. He said, bring your younger brother back. He was testing them to see if they had changed. And they brought the younger brother back, Benjamin, the only other child of Rachel and Jacob. And then he said, he's going to have to stay here. I'm not going to go into all the details how that happened with the cup and everything, but most of you remember the story. And the brothers said, oh no, we cannot do this to our father. We cannot do this. This will break his heart. He's already lost one son. He can't lose this one. And we know that Joseph prepares the dinner, or has it prepared, invites them to it, and they're thinking, oh, the worst is going to happen to us now. And he finally reveals himself to them. And I'm not going to go into any more details other than to say we're going to find some lessons here, and we're going to look at the verses now. I just did all that just to refresh your memories, because maybe you haven't thought about Joseph. How many of you knew most of that information? Or at least it made you say, oh, that's right. And here is this man, boy, but he's 30 years of age when he becomes the second in command of Egypt, who stayed true to God. What other men of the New Testament stayed true to God even in prison, and God did something wonderful? Paul and Silas, remember that? Instead of complaining about being in prison for doing the right thing, they praised God in song. And we know the earthquake came, they were released, and instead of running away, they stayed long enough that the Philippian jailer was saved. and all his household, and then baptized into the faith. And God works in every situation we find ourselves in. And I want to just look at these lessons now in the last 10 minutes I have this morning with you. Lesson 1, and we probably have experienced this, doing the right thing in the eyes of God does not always mean that things are going to go good for us. You understand what I'm saying? Even when you do what's right, as Joseph did in the situation with Potiphar's wife, it doesn't always mean that everything's going to turn out great for us. Every Christian has to realize that following Jesus Christ is not always convenient, does not always pave the roads ahead of us. It will lead at times to difficulties and to persecution. What did Jesus say in John 15, verse 18? He says, if the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. And if you're saying you're one of my people, don't be surprised if the world then hates you for that. And what did Jesus say in Matthew 5:11? Listen to these words. Blessed are you, not if. I think this is always important. Jesus says, blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Again, blessed are you, not if people persecute you, but when people treat you badly, in other words. When life doesn't go the way you think it should because you have been faithful to God and you have done what God wanted, just as Joseph did. Life doesn't always go the way we expect, does it? He resisted the temptation of Potiphar's wife and ended up in prison for that. But he stayed faithful. Did he go to prison and say, I give up on God? No. God was with him. He stayed faithful. God raised him up. And look what happened. He eventually became number 2 in all of Egypt. Lesson 2, folks. God is with us no matter where we might find ourselves in our journey of life. No matter where you are right now, God is with you. The biggest temptation that we have at times is to say, where is God? He has abandoned me. He has left me alone. He's not in this situation. He promised to be with me. Where is he? But even in those times, I will tell you, God is with you just as he was with Joseph in the household where he was a slave, in the prison where he was thrown, when he was working as number 2 in Egypt. God was with Joseph. Joseph's story shows each of us how we can experience God's presence even in unjust and difficult times that we might face as Christians. That's what David said. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Why? For you are with me. He is with us in every situation of life. The Lord was with Joseph. I already read them, Genesis 39:2. The Lord was with him. 39:20 and 21, while Jesus was there in prison. The Lord was with him. Genesis 41:38. Pharaoh asked him, can we find anyone like this man, one on whom is the Spirit of God? God was with Joseph. And lesson 3. God blesses as we are faithful, no matter the situation we find ourselves in. Psalm 1:1 reads this way. Blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked, or stand in the way that sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers. In Psalm 118:1, blessed are those whose ways are blameless, who walk according to the law of the Lord. And that's what Joseph did. Even though he was far away from any priests, any family pressures to conform to the will of God, he still stayed faithful to his God and the law as he knew it, and did not commit adultery when no one would have known, at least none of the Hebrews would have known. James 1:17 from the New Testament, James 1:17. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. Persevering in spite of what the world does to us, staying faithful to our God. God provides and blesses those who persevere and follow him. He honors patience and perseverance in our time of troubles. There's something to be said about honoring the Lord and being faithful to him no matter where we might find ourselves on this journey of life. Lesson 4. Forgiveness is not an option as a Christian in our lives. If we want God's purposes to succeed in our life, we have to learn to forgive. When Joseph's brothers realized who he was, and Joseph revealed himself, they were rightly so scared for their lives. Here is the kid, now a man in charge of their lives there in Egypt. The one that they had plotted to even kill and ended up selling into slavery. Yet he said, who am I to judge you? Who am I? God planned this. God's the one that sent me here, for he knew that God's purposes are always good. Luke 6:37, Jesus said this, do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Colossians 3:13, bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. The Lord's Prayer. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. Forgiveness. Joseph had every right to be angry and vengeful, and had the means and opportunity to do that when it came to his brothers. But he recognized it was not his place, and that God could take even the bad and evil that was plotted against him and use it for his purposes. And the last lesson I want to mention this morning, lesson 5, God will make all things work together for good. You all know this verse, but I'm going to read it again. Romans 8:28. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. And I'm not going to say, and I have heard people say, God causes the bad things to happen to do his purposes. I don't believe that. I don't believe God said, you sell or kill your brother or you sell him. But what I believe is God can use that. And I'm sure Joseph didn't see it at the time. Joseph didn't say, God, it's okay I'm being sold into slavery, because I know you're going to save my country, men. You're going to save the Hebrews because of this. He couldn't see that. And we have to realize that sometimes in our life, it seems like our life is a mess. And we don't understand how God can bring good out of it, but God is working even in the messes of life to bring about good. I often say, in the tragedies of life, you don't know who, touched by that tragedy, will feel the presence of God, hear the word of God, and respond. I don't know God's mysterious ways. We're told his ways are far above us. We don't always understand it. And Joseph, I'm sure, couldn't see it. But when he looked back, he was able to say to his brothers, hey, God was in this. And God was with me. And God is using this. Genesis 45:7-8. Listen to these words that he said to his brothers when they were standing there trembling in his presence. He said, but God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. God used that. And I love, and this is my favorite verse from Genesis, found in Genesis 50:20. I think I put it in your bulletin. I hope I did. You intended to harm me, he says to his brothers, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. As I said, because we have free will and we come from a tradition that believes people can sin or not sin. People can choose to go against God. God doesn't make the evil happen. God can take his power and take even evil situations and use them for his purposes because he's God. He is beyond anything we can understand. Joseph, sold into slavery, was there at just the right time when famine struck to have been put in the position of preparing Egypt to help feed the people surrounding that country, and it took care of the Hebrew children. Now, some people also, some scholars think that not only was Joseph used of God to help feed them, but also to get the Hebrew children at that time who were now being corrupted by all the people around them in Canaan, out of there to a place where they could continue to develop as the people of God until called out when they were more cohesive and more dependent upon God. I don't know that, but I do know, I see in the life of Joseph how God takes care of us and how God will use even those things that seem bad to bring about good. God's plans and purposes, brother and sister, are greater than our own. God's guidance in our lives can be completely incomprehensible at times. And I think some of you might agree to that. Joseph's life story teaches us that, nevertheless, even when we don't understand what's going on, God is in control. And suffering or hard times that God's people go through are not always bad, but are used to bring about God's good. And God can use whatever we go through to advance his kingdom. So I tell you this, even though your life or my life at times might seem to be a total mess, beyond our understanding, in those times we need to have the courage to trust our God who says, I take you by the right hand, I go before you, and even in the prisons of life and in the terrible situations, I can be with you and will be. He is the one we can put our trust in.